As Indiana lawmakers concluded their short session last week, more than 170 bills have been moving from the Indiana General Assembly's chambers to Governor Eric Holcomb's desk. With aspirations of a session featuring measured changes, lawmakers ended up addressing the demand for child care, established procedures to elevate third-grade reading scores, and securing a 13th check for public employees, and then deferring most legislation with price tags like Medicaid, education, taxes, and roads until next year. Now, our guests tonight look back at the past weeks at the State House and look ahead to what could be a busy budget season in 25. Welcome to Primetime. I'm Bruce Haines, and with us today are Mike Wolf. He is Chair and Professor of Political Science and Acting Director of the Mike Downs Center for Indiana Politics at Purdue University, Fort Wayne. With Mike is Fred McKissack, Editorial Page Editor at the Journal Gazette, and Mitch Harper, local attorney and former state representative. And we welcome you to the program as well. If you'd like to join us, please feel free to call us at the numbers you see on the screen, and we'll widen out, and here we all are, filling up the whole frame. We have we have Fred and Mike and Mitch, and you're not allowed to change chairs because then I'll mess that up again. Thank you guys for being here. Appreciate it.
Sure.
So indeed, in January, those 9 weeks prior, it was House and Senate leadership saying that they see the session as a less aggressive one, more tweaks, more fine-tuning. So let me ask each of you in relative terms, was it a quieter session?
No. Okay, there was a lot of heated rhetoric. Yes. As far as tweaks, I'm looking at the third grade retention issue. That's not a tweak. In fact, was it the year before they had brought in the science of reading as a requirement for schools, which makes sense. I don't think anybody's going to look at this issue and say, well, we shouldn't do anything. But instead of letting the science of reading program move along, they decided to get involved in something that ultimately I think is just a mess for schools. And then again, another unfunded mandate, summer schools, that kids actually don't really have to attend. So yes, I would say rhetorically, yeah, it was a lot of heat, but tweaks, it didn't feel tweaky to me.
Right. Mike, how about you?
Yeah, I think the same thing. And in a non-budgetary year, sometimes you move into the regulatory realm or the culture war realm. So we kind of talked about that maybe it wouldn't be a surprise if you can't be doling out dollars and cents. You can be talking about values and other things. And so obviously we saw in education, the third grade bill and some of the other legislation. Higher education saw, some regulation that was unexpected. But so I think we saw some other kind of movements about home rule, I think, as far as what localities can and can't do, that we've seen trends as well. So it was, I guess, not surprising, but it wasn't quiet.
Yeah. Mitch, how about you, sir?
I think we discussed when we last met that probably it's going to be a quiet session because it's an election year. They didn't want to inject a lot of things that could become issues. But as has been mentioned, I think legislators were picking out some things that they intend to run on in their district. And as it turned out, there were some controversial measures that were pursued and that caused some heat, and particularly on home rule in Indianapolis, which there are plenty of lessons for the other cities in the state.
Yeah.
Well, and that gets to the takeaways as we've been watching the weeks go by and making notes in the margins. What do your notes suggest to you as you look back on this session?
Well, I think one of the disturbing things was toward the tail end, without discussion in committee, was tagging language onto the Public Access Counselor bill, which more restricts the Public Access Counselor, Luke Britt, who's been in that position since he was appointed a little over 10 years ago. He's done a great job, and I deal with him as the county council attorney. I've been to the seminars that he puts on once a year. His judgment's been sound, and I will tell you that I contacted the governor's office because of my concern over that bill. There are law firms in this state that advise local units of government, particularly school corporations how to deny access requests and public meeting requests. And that's their default position to advise this in case of the school superintendent. Their default position ought to be what I think I've tried to counsel, which is everything's open unless there's a good reason for personnel or for health issues and so on to keep it constrained. But there are lots of people around the state. They won't contact news media. They won't contact a lawyer. They're turned away from getting access to records, and those folks need to be assured that there's a strong counselor to local governments.
Mm-hmm. Can I add something to that? I completely agree, and I think it's one of these issues that will probably sail over most people because they don't realize the importance of that position. Yes, as a journalist, it's good to have the access counselor there, but I think for everybody to have access to open records is a fundamental right, I think, in this republic. But what bothered me so much about this was that this happened in the Senate. This was a House bill that started off about bringing civility to public meetings. I cannot remember the author of the bill. I think he's from, I want to say Gas City, but anyway, that doesn't matter. It gets to the Senate, and this is when Britt gets attacked by, it was Senator Freeman's Senate committee, and I don't think it was a committee that it was supposed to go to in the first place. I think he actually asked for it. And there's a lot of I don't know, machinations going on in the background that people probably are not going to see and understand. But this feels very personal, like a personal attack, rather than saying, well, we need to curtail him because he's made bad decisions. I don't think anybody has looked at what Britt has done, Luke Britt, has done and thought he's doing a terrible job. But he has gone against, some sacred cows in Indianapolis, particularly school boards down there in Hamilton County and the public library in Hamilton County. And I think that really chafed some people. It's an unfortunate situation, though.
It's one of two bills that the governor's not reached a decision on signing yet, so we may see this weekend some movement.
And we'll come back to the other bill in just a moment. And Mike, let me get to you though, sir, with what kinds of things are sticking with you now that the gavel's down?
Yeah, one of the things we talked about is that Indiana is one of 39 states that it's a trifecta, that one party controls the governor and both have chambers. And it's not a surprise that we see legislation passing elsewhere that called diffusion of innovation in the federalism literature, that good ideas elsewhere to one of the parties will spread. And so it's not a surprise that we saw the tenure bill, for instance, and some of the other legislation that may be more ideological when you have a supermajority that did come. So while Indiana certainly, we can study what happened this session, it was a lot like what happened in other states on both chambers, for both sides of the party. So I think that we'll increasingly see Indiana take on or create its own innovations, and other states that are Republican will pick those up, as was Colorado or California and some of the other states move in the exact opposite position. And it's ironic because as Washington seems to be at a standstill, the states are moving, but they're moving in very different directions policy-wise, and Indiana's one of them.
Interesting. Brett, how about you, sir?
There are a couple of things. We, in tomorrow's paper, my colleague Jeff Kovaleski has written a long editorial on what we thought was the good bills, what we thought were the bad bills, and some things that were sort of, we don't know yet. But I would say youth employment is something that people should really look into. Granted, I think allowing 18-year-olds to serve alcohol as long as there's a person who can supervise them is fine. I moved here from Wisconsin 20 years ago, so I was really shocked that didn't exist here. But allowing essentially businesses to work kids longer than they need to be, especially at a time when we talk about, their need, they need to be in school, they need to learn, they need to, having longer working hours. This is like, again, the slippery slope. Okay, where does it end? Also, allowing family farms, not family farms, allowing kids to work on farms is another issue because you look at records and you could, the agricultural industry has a high number of people who were injured on the job. It is a part of that industry. But again, do we really want 16, 17-year-olds and 18-year-olds in high school doing that right now when we want them to, again, study so much and work them so much? It's just, this is a slippery slope for me.
Right. You mentioned, Mitch, two bills the governor's not acted on. I believe the other is the one regarding anti-Semitism, the definition and the action on it. Let me ask each of you, the governor was kind of concerned about whether or not that the definition that was included or recommended for inclusion, the specific contemporary examples of it were pulled from the final bill. The governor's has some reservations. Why is this one so complicated? But then again, I guess that could be rhetorical, the whole understanding of the Middle East and though the impact on legislation itself can be equally complicated. So I'm going to ask an attorney. Go ahead.
And I'm not sure. I mean, we've seen around the country a rising number of attacks on temples and synagogues and other places of Jewish activity. People are in danger, and the failure to agree kind of commonly has struck me as odd. There's been a weighing in of some of the prominent Jewish groups, and particularly in Indianapolis, regarding this language. I'm not sure why there was such back and forth.
Yeah, it's a difficult issue, clearly, given what just happened in October. Given the idea of what is anti-Semitism and what is maybe criticism of Israel, but where there's crossover there, and it's hard to disentangle that, and we've seen that probably in other states more than in Indiana. But so we've seen, as mentioned, interest groups on both sides, Jewish groups even, disagreeing and having a hard time coming up. Do these examples provide a definition, or are they backed up? When are the examples part of the definition and not? I think that's really some of the issues that they faced in wrestling with us.
In light of all of this, Fred, Indiana Attorney General Todd Rokita Tuesday called on Holcomb to veto the bill, which he dubbed a toothless mess.
If you want to call it a toothless mess, it's toothless because you didn't add in the definitions. You ask an organization, you ask a group of people what the bill should be about, then you don't take their advice. Then you have to bring in part of a definition, but not a whole definition. Anti-Semitism isn't new. There were some, there are groups like the Southern Poverty Group. I can't remember the total organization, but they study, racism in America and nationalism. And there have been some anti-Semitic things going on in this country for the last 8 years. So this isn't new. What bothers me is that, again, you ask a group of people to come in, talk about the issue. I think the idea is great, but if you're not going to listen to people who are living anti-Semitism and take them seriously and say, yes, we'll add in the definitions because this is there to help you and help us, then yeah, it's toothless in that way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and in thinking of this as one of the unresolved of the more than 170 bills that in fact are resolved, one of the earliest bills to go to the governor was the one related to wetlands definition. Mitch, I'm going to ask you about this one too. No, I'm not sure any of us necessarily saw that one coming, but it came and found its way forward in a relatively short amount of time.
It follows on last year's wetlands bill, some of it prompted by court decisions looking at the Federal Act, which I think a lot of observers would say was overly aggressive in the classification of what was a wetland. But Indiana may have gone too far in the other direction. There's certainly and I will say here in Allen County, I mean, this is a flyover country for migratory birds, and it's important to preserve this. And if you let them go, if you let the wetlands go, you let them go forever. And the legislature 2 years in a row sort of going the other direction, you sort of fear what might occur next year.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
In regulation,
please.
I mean, with adversary, what countries can own property or mining rights and other things, there's been a lot of regulatory issues in this session that kind of much more quietly, not the highlights, but big kind of issues. I mean, what will happen if China decides, well, U.S. you can't own property here, or other, there's a lot going on here when you start to regulate, both in the positive and negative. We had big pornography legislation too, right? The name or ID, had a proof of age. So the regulatory stuff is always controversial, but again, when you're not necessarily paying for something, hospitals too, right? About antitrust, but there's not a mechanism necessarily of how it's going to be regulated.
I think there was some real genuine concern about the Chinese land purchases because Indiana's home of the Crane Naval Facility. That's one of America's premier military research facilities, and there were records of land purchases being very nearby.
Right.
I think there were some very legitimate national security concerns.
I don't disagree at all. Yeah, I mean, it's a real issue, and we've seen that.
Yeah, but then the counterpart of that is, and I agree, if there are national security issues to look at, but then you have the rhetorical tax about getting rid of sister cities. I mean, going back to the 1950s, which is where the Sister Cities program comes out of, it was about fostering some understanding between smaller groups of people, citizens of Fort Wayne, talking maybe to citizens in China or Japan or around the world. So that's what really upset me, was instead of finding a balance and speaking to the obvious issue, we create something totally beyond the pale of reason to make the point that we're scared of China or we're worried about China. I think you could just say, yes, we shouldn't allow them to have land purchases around Crane Naval Facility, but then to attack sister cities or even sister states, that doesn't make any sense to me.
Fred, are you saying that perhaps Indiana's statewide election issues this year shouldn't concern Indiana's foreign policy as much?
It should concern some foreign policy. But let's be honest. Let's have an honest discussion about it. Yeah.
One of the observations that surfaces in a short session is how many pieces of legislation seem to have a financial impact to them in the conversation, so much so that it was even House Speaker Todd Houston who was saying that most things end up having in some way a budget impact, so they're going to Senate Finance, they're going to House Ways and Means. Mitch, was that your experience as well in recognizing that something that seems procedural suddenly maybe has a dollar sign somewhere?
Well, there was the beginning that some things were sent to Senate Finance and some things were not, and it seemed some appeared discretionary on the part of Senate or House leadership at times. I do think in the Senate with Senator Mishler has concerns over how a lot of these issues are going to be resolved going forward. I think he's looking for a more comprehensive solution that probably could not have occurred this year. And so some of those things being, particularly in the Senate Finance, look for Senator Mishler to be very active and look for a lot of action next year. And I think he's really showing a leadership role in that regard.
I would agree.
Mm-hmm. You all have some extra thoughts written before you, and I want to be sure that if there is something that has not been stated, that there's a chance to share. I know we're looking too at some legislation which was introduced in '24 in a way as a trial balloon. without the necessary speed limits to 75 miles an hour, for example. Just wanting to see what the reaction was like in committee, and then possibly bringing something back in a larger session. Share with me if that's just the way the machinery goes, that we will swear we've seen this bill somewhere before in 12 months.
That's not unusual. Having a bill introduced and perhaps a committee chair doesn't move it along, or it doesn't have the votes to pass, you find out where the opposition is, and perhaps some people need a little more education. Some interest groups may need to be brought along. It's part of a process. I will tell you that having served in the legislature and then having served in the Fort Wayne City Council, I found my fellow city council members reluctant to put in an ordinance that they had developed that might be defeated. And it's like a defeat gives vital information. And I think that's what you see with some of these bills regarding, as you call them, trial balloons.
Yeah, and Mike, from your position.
Again, from the political science standpoint, we're a non-professional legislative state, so they have very limited time. So it's not a surprise. You'd see things come in iterative fashion. One year, you get a reading. Next year, it gets a vote. The year after, it becomes legislation. Whereas in some other states, they go year round, and they can kick it back to committee, and they'll vote on it in 3 months after they fix it up. So it's a product, I think, also of the structure of our system.
Mm-hmm. So Fred, how much of 2024 is essentially, while one session ends, the next session immediately starts? It seems that we're heading down a...
Yeah, well, they've already said that we're going to see an exciting budget session next year. But I don't know, it's an interesting thing about these trial balloons, if we can go back to that real quick, because I was thinking about the PFAS, what was it, House Bill 1399, that would have essentially allowed, remove thousands of those chemicals that we know through science, cause prostate cancer, kidney problems, testicular cancer, diabetes. The fact that it was struck down and then they tried to bring it back, when will you get the idea that this is not a good idea? But it also brings up the point of something I wanted to ask you earlier, which is, having been in those sessions, how does that work? I mean, when people, it feels like they were trying to sneak something over, I don't think people understand how that works when a House bill or a Senate bill is struck down, and then part of it goes into maybe another bill.
Well, in the old days, there was bill stripping. Mm-hmm. You could have a bill go to conference committee, and people would have talked about something important, but no bill had been advanced all the way through toward the end. And then in conference committee, the original contents were totally stripped out, and something with a very different topic got inserted with days to go. Mm-hmm. That can't happen anymore. There were some terrible excesses. But now the rule is it has to have passed one chamber, or it can't be considered for insertion into conference committee. Mm-hmm. But it still happens.
It still happens. Yeah.
We have Judy with an offline question. I want to share it with you, and we all have about 15 seconds to try to answer it. But as was discussed early on, what are your thoughts on sending kids to school early due to daylight savings time? Should we be making a change? Ready, set, go.
Well, we've seen at the federal level, so this is one of these situations. Indiana, obviously, we didn't used to change. Mm-hmm. It's only 20 years since we actually switched with this, and it's been controversial. But at the federal level, the U.S. Senate has passed legislation to do away with this, and the House hasn't. I wouldn't be surprised if, if we see at the federal level, we just do away with daylight savings time overall, based on some of these concerns.
Fred?
I would agree, especially when you're a parent with kids in school. This is a big issue.
And Mitch?
When I was in the legislature, I said I was a time agnostic. I could set my time to whatever was decided. And when we would get, back in the days of snail mail, we'd get these piles equally high of the proponents and the opponents. Once it changed, though, and I was out of the General Assembly, I'd prefer we were iconoclastic and staying on regular time all year long.
Well, and in our time, we are out of it completely for this edition of Prime Time. And my thanks to Mitch Harper and to Mike Wolf and to Fred McKissack and to you for joining us as well. For all of us with the program, I'm Bruce Haines. Take care, and we'll see you again next week. Have a good night. The preceding program on PBS Fort Wayne was made possible in part by
Businesses constantly evolve. The Rogers Company started as Rogers Markets in 1944. Today, the Rogers Company is commercial property and real estate development and a proud supporter of PBS Fort Wayne. The Regional Chamber of Northeast Indiana advocates for world-class infrastructure, a competitive business climate, 21st century talent, and rural investment. One region, one voice. NEINadvocates.com.